Well, Kenneth Roth is a visiting professor at Princeton University. He's also the former executive director of Human Rights Watch. He joins us live now from New York. Welcome to Al Jazeera. What do you make of the Israeli army's conduct in the occupied West Bank in light of this current operation?
Well, clearly, this is the largest military operation that we've seen in the West Bank in years. I think the big issue, really, as your correspondent just mentioned, is, what are the legal standards that are governing it? Ordinarily, with Israel's endless occupation, the standards should be those that apply to law enforcement, to the police on the street. And that means, as the correspondent just said, you cannot use lethal force except as a last resort to meet an imminent lethal threat. Ordinarily, you have to try to detain people. Now, it looks like that's not what Israel's doing. It is bombing away. And indeed, the Israeli foreign minister, Israel Katz, said this is a war. Now, in war, you can just shoot the other side's combatants. No need to try to capture them. Nothing about last resort. So if Israel is now escalating its standards for the use of lethal force to war standards, that is a very grave development for the people of the West Bank. Now, even in that case, it still has a duty to take all feasible precautions to spare civilians the harm of armed conflict, but it can just shoot to kill people whom it deems militants. Now, that would be a big, big step. And I think the Secretary General and the UN are right to be pushing back on that because we've seen what that can mean for Gaza. The last thing we need is for that to be replicated in the West Bank.
You mentioned Gaza there. I mean, to what extent have the horrors of Gaza allowed Israel's operations in the occupied West Bank to happen almost under the radar, as it were?
Well, I mean, the world is horrified by what's happening in Gaza. And, rightfully, our attention has been focused there. But, we shouldn't neglect the fact that, quite apart from these kinds of raids by the Israeli military itself, Israeli settlers have been routinely attacking Palestinian civilians, at minimum doing it with the Israeli security forces just kind of closing their eyes to it, often actively assisted by Israeli security forces. So, there has been a degree of violence by Israelis and Israeli forces that we just haven't seen in recent history. And it seems now to be getting worse.
What about the timing, then, of this particular operation in the occupied West Bank? Why now?
It's so hard to put one's mind inside of Netanyahu's. Clearly he is uninterested in peace in Gaza. He keeps, finding ways to obstruct the ceasefire negotiations. But, one particularly worrying thing, when we talk about, possible parallels between Gaza and the West Bank. In Gaza, as we know, the devastation caused by the Israeli military has forcibly displaced some 90% of the population. And the two far-right ministers of Netanyahu's government, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, have talked openly about, their interest in just, expelling 2 million Palestinians, just removing them from the demographic balance sheet and pushing them into Egypt. Now, Egypt doesn't want that. They've resisted. But suddenly, the Israeli foreign minister started talking about the need to displace people in the West Bank as well. And I think we really have to nip that sentiment in the bud, because the last thing we want is this kind of massive displacement taking place in the West Bank, too. And, frankly, the dream of the far-right ministers in Netanyahu's government is to, solve the problem of the West Bank, solve the problem of the apartheid regime that Israel is maintaining there by just getting rid of the Palestinians. Now, that would be, a massive war crime. But, this is what, certain members of the Netanyahu government whose votes in the Knesset Netanyahu needs to stay in power, this is what they talk about. So, again, this is an urgent reason to nip this in the bud and not to let this continue down the path that we've seen in Gaza.
Given what you've said then, how much pressure is Benjamin Netanyahu under at the moment, especially domestically?
Well, domestically, he seems to be able to get away with whatever he does. So, apart from the families of the hostages who are really upset with him for basically sacrificing the hostages to his endless war in Gaza, he doesn't seem to be under a lot of domestic pressure. The big source of pressure that could make a difference is Joe Biden. But Joe Biden, says the right thing periodically. He, did stop delivery of the massive 2,000-pound bombs that were devastating Palestinian neighborhoods in Gaza. But other than that, it's a complete green light for ongoing arms sales, ongoing supply of military aid. And so, Biden says the right thing, but completely undermines it with what he does.
Kenneth Roth, we very much appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.